In this video, we're going to talk about modes of survey data collection. Modes being the ways or modalities or technologies of collecting survey data. So whether you use the internet or a telephone or paper questionnaire. And I should point out that the modes of survey data collection are rapidly changing and very responsive to new developments of new technology. So particularly with the internet and with new ways of contacting people using social media or cell phones or tablets and all kinds of new technology. It's a rapidly evolving industry, and by the way, it is an industry. Survey research is there are major companies all around the world that specialize in survey data collection in the United States and Europe and all over the world. It's a major industry because governments and businesses and institutes around the world need to collect survey data and usually work with firms that specialize in doing it. And these firms are constantly kind of experimenting and evolving new and better ways to reach people and to collect survey data. So we'll go through some of the major modes and do this kind of quickly, and then look a little bit at their advantages and disadvantages in this video. So we'll begin with what's called the intercept interview survey. This is a basic and inexpensive way often of collecting survey data. It's essentially stopping people in public places, with your clipboard or your tablet computer and asking them questions. And it's one of the typical examples of this is an exit polling, where people are stopped after voting and interviewed about how they voted and why. But it's also useful for things like surveying users of a park or a transit system or a library or a museum or a health clinic, anywhere where people are naturally sort of gathered in a public place. They can be stopped and interviewed. And so its advantages are that it's a practical way to reach these kinds of populations, and it's often quick and fairly inexpensive to implement. But it does have some disadvantages. It's not very good for long, complex questionnaires because people usually don't want to spend time on the spot, sufficient time to answer a very lengthy questionnaire, and it can be difficult to monitor interviewers, just like any survey that involves interviewers out in the field has that same sort of issue. And another mode of survey data collection is the household interview. And this is very traditional, old, established way of doing surveys, but it's still widely used. It's used in the United States. It's used in Europe for many of the major social and government surveys here and in Europe, but it's also used all over the world, and particularly in developing countries, where one of the most practical and thorough ways to reach people is to visit people in their homes, in particularly sort of rural areas or areas of poverty, and interview them in their homes, and that's called the household interview survey. And often these days it's done with computer devices, computer-assisted interviewing. It's called CAPI, or even self-interviewing CASI. But so laptops or tablets are used, but it can also be done with paper forms. And some of the most, as I mentioned, some of the most established social and government surveys do this. It's got some distinct advantages. First of all, it tends to be fairly rigorous. The sampling that goes into household surveys, it tends to be multi-stage sampling. There are generally high response rates because usually when someone takes the time to go out and visit a household, the household sort of sees the importance of the survey and encourages participation. And interestingly, it also allows for physical observation. So when the interviewer is there visiting the household, they can observe the type of housing unit, the condition of basic, physical condition of the housing unit, some neighborhood characteristics, and so on. There are some distinct disadvantages though also. It's a very time-consuming and very expensive way of collecting survey data. Often because it involves a research worker in the field, the sample is clustered, which produces larger standard errors or wider confidence intervals. The people are typically interviewed in a cluster of houses in an area rather than just one at a time. So the data has that characteristic. It's clustered, and then it can be difficult, as with any field interview, to monitor the interviewers and make sure they're completing the survey accurately and not falsifying data and that sort of thing. Okay, another form of interview survey, so we're talking here in the beginning about interview surveys, is the telephone interview survey, which was the most widely used method for many, many years. It's now in decline, though, because of problems reaching people by telephone. And I'll say a bit more about that in a little bit. It's often done with computer-assisted interviewing technology, meaning the interviewers are at a computer terminal and they're entering data as they interview people on the phone. There's some very established and large surveys that still make use of telephone interviews. The Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, which is one of the largest surveys of its kind in the world, is hundreds of thousands of interviews every year done by telephone, in which people are asked about their health behaviors. We talked in the measurement week, we gave the example of the Consumer Sentiment Index. That's done by a telephone interview. Many of the major polling organizations, Gallup and Pew in the United States, Pew does surveys and Gallup does also all over the world, but Ipsos and others still do a great deal of public opinion polling using telephones. But again, things are shifting because of the problems with reaching people by telephone. Now, I should mention also some of these telephone surveys, people are experimenting with automated telephone surveys, sometimes called interactive voice response technology, where basically a computerized caller reaches you and you respond by pushing the buttons. But those surveys have fairly low response rates. So some of the advantages of telephone surveys: they're faster and less expensive than household interviews. That's why they really took off beginning around the 70s and 80s and onwards. It became much more practical to reach people in their homes through the telephone than to visit them. So that's an advantage. But there are some real disadvantages increasingly these days. And the big one is the declining response rate. People are less and less likely to answer their phones and to participate. There are also major coverage problems because much of the sampling that goes with telephone surveys involves random digit dialing of landlines, and fewer households have landlines, and reaching people by cell phones can be done, but it has some challenges, particularly in terms of trying to randomly sample cell phone numbers. The system is different and it doesn't work the same way. Okay, now we're going to talk about some methods of self-administered surveys. We'll begin with the most basic and old form or well-established form, which is the mail survey, mailing out questionnaires and having people mail them back. It's a mail self-administered survey. So it's a tried and true method, but it's still very, very important in the United States and in other countries too. For example, the U.S. Census is essentially a mailed self-administered survey. Most households complete their census forms by filling out a questionnaire that's mailed by the Census Bureau. The American Community Survey, which is the data collection that happens in between the census, is also a paper form that's mailed out. And other governments and organizations still use mail surveys. Now, some of the advantages: there are low costs generally with a mail survey. And also, interestingly, geographic targeting, because addresses are well established and you can target a geographic area with a mail survey. But there are some real disadvantages. It requires literacy, obviously, that you need to read the instructions and the questions in order to answer a mail survey. Um, Related to that is the issue of multiple languages. Many countries and communities are multilingual areas, and typically a mail survey can only be printed in one language, and so therefore it becomes a challenge to try to figure out how to include people who don't speak the main language. And it's not good for complex questionnaires with a lot of skip patterns or complicated branching or logic. It's hard to follow that kind of thing on a paper questionnaire. Okay, another kind of self-administered questionnaire is a group self-administered questionnaire. So rather than mailing out forms, you send a research worker to a group setting and distribute the questionnaire in a group and have people fill it out on their own, and then the research worker collects the responses. And this is obviously good for people who are already in group settings like schools or nursing homes or health clinics maybe. And a good example of this is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is one of the ways the United States tracks the health behaviors of young people. It's administered to groups, classes of young people, randomly sampled around the United States. A research worker shows up, distributes the questionnaires, provides instructions, and gathers the completed responses. Now, it has some distinct advantages. It's efficient in many ways because it gathers a lot of responses at one time. And also another advantage is that there is a research worker there on the site to help with any questions or problems that come up in the survey. So it's got some of the advantages of an interviewer survey, which is that there's a person there to help guide the respondent in not in the sense of steering or influencing the respondent's answers, but to help with questions or problems, so that the survey gets filled out properly and completely. But there are some disadvantages. The group setting can influence the responses. People can shout out answers or make fun of questions, and that can, in some ways, contaminate the whole group in terms of how it's responding. Because it's a group setting, also it's a highly clustered sample, similar to household interviews, which tend to be clusters of households. This is even more clustered. A group self-administered survey, almost by definition, is one that's very highly clustered.